and welcome. The Broadband Bunch Zero Touch Learning Series is live. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm David Campbell. Today's session is entitled Project Gigabit, How the UK is Moving Forward at Light Speed. Next slide. The Broadband Bunch podcasts and Zero Touch Learning Series is brought to you, as always, by the Zero Touch Automation Experts ETI Software Solutions, along with Utopia Fibre, DXTEL, Calix, and ITK Solutions Group. Be sure to follow the Broadband Bunch on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can always access Broadband Bunch podcasts on your favorite podcast players such as Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and more. A couple of quick reminders before we introduce our guest today. The session is most definitely interactive. We encourage you to submit questions via the questions or the chat box. Our team will be monitoring those throughout the event. The session is also being recorded and will be available to all attendees for future access. Please feel free to submit potential topics for future Zero Touch Learning Series sessions or suggest prospective panelists. Thanks in advance for your participation. Now, I'm excited to introduce our distinguished host, Heather Burnett-Gold. Heather is a CEO of HBG Strategies, a consultancy engaged in broadband education targeted at enabling fibre deployment among underserved communities. A 30-year-plus industry veteran, Heather most recently served as the President CEO of the Fibre Broadband Association, the only all-fibre trade association in the Americas. Prior to that, she was the SVP of External Affairs and Access Management for EXO Communications. Heather, take it away.
Thank you, David. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our attendees from over the pond as we present this exciting panel on the new initiative proposed in the UK, Project Gigabit. The government has pledged £5 billion British pounds to bring next-gen gigabit broadband to previously and underserved areas of the UK, starting immediately. We have with us today 4 expert panelists who will discuss the reality of the program and its chances for success. Let me introduce them. First, Vincent Garnier, who is the director of the FTTH Council EU. The trade association represents builders and their suppliers of all fiber networks across the European footprint. Mr. Garnier will assist in our understanding of where the UK sits today versus its neighbors. Next, Justin Ogi, who is Chief Technology and Operations Officer of Ogi, a company building in South Wales. Mr. Leese also was at the DCMS, the agency that was responsible for launching Project Gigabit, and perhaps can give us some perspective on that as well. Next, Richard Thorpe, Chief Delivery Officer at City Fibre, a wholesale operator providing critical fiber infrastructure in primarily urban environments with plans for 60 cities on its list. And last but not least, Steve Leighton, the CEO of Voneus, a company totally focused on very remote and rural communities. Understanding how to connect these communities will be critical to the success of Project Gigabit as the UK seeks to close its digital divide. First, Mr. Garnier, can you walk us through where we are with respect to the UK and the rest of Europe?
Absolutely, thank you. I'm very happy to be on this very interesting panel. What I would like to share with you is some data point coming from the FTTH Council Market Panorama. And if you could please move to the next slide. This analysis is actually made on an annual basis. It covers 39 countries in Europe, one of them being the UK. I will present 3-4 slides in the 5 minutes. Everything is available on the FTTH Council website, so you can always refer to that, download the full study, and deep dive into these numbers at a later stage. So when we look at the current situation of FTTH coverage, measuring home passed in proportion of the total number of households in the different countries in the European Union, you can see that there are very significant differences between the best in class and those at the bottom. And at the bottom, we find currently the UK. These numbers are based on September 2020 figures. Since then, a lot has taken place already, and I will mention that in the following slide. But at the end of 2020, the UK FTTH coverage was around 15%. Now, if we move to the next slide, we can see that that's actually good news, because if we look at what is still in front of us, and for those who are in the business of FTTH deployment, you'll be happy to see that the UK is the second largest potential for fiber deployment in Europe. A lot still has to be done. With Germany and Italy, the UK represents 60% of the potential market for FTTH in EU 27 plus UK. So the vast majority of what still has to be connected will be in the UK. Now you see there are other countries, but clearly, if Europe wants to achieve its goal of full FTTH coverage, what happens in the UK is absolutely essential. Next slide. So the previous slide were about coverage. Now we're looking at numbers for subscriber penetration rate. So how many households actually provided internet service access using full fiber technology. Here again, you see that currently, or at least at the end of 2020, coverage, the percentage of subscribers using full fiber for their internet connection was close to 4%. Now, the projection for the future is totally different. And if we already go to the next slide, we will see that what we expect for the future, and this is a number which come from our forecast, which have been recently released, is that we expect the UK to move very rapidly from probably around 8 to 9% coverage at the end of 21 to close to 63% at the end of 26. It's a dramatic change that we are seeing in many countries, but that is increasingly true of the United Kingdom or of Germany, for example. And please note the situation also of France, which is expected to really reach close to 87% by 26. So everything will be reshaped, and clearly Europe FTTH market is going to be extremely active in the next 5 years, at least according to forecast and objective coming from all countries as they are reflected in this survey. Next slide. And just to finish this initial presentation, I would like to insist on the importance of bridging the digital divide between rural areas and the rest of the country. On average in Europe, the FTTH coverage in low density area is just half of what it is in the general country. So there is a ratio of 1 to 1. Rural penetration of fiber is 22%, when on average, the penetration of fiber in Europe is close to 50%. In the UK, the situation is actually proportionally in a better shape, because the coverage of FTTH in rural area is 10%, when 15% is the average FTTH deployment in the UK, probably due to a lot of activity in rural area so far. Now, things will nevertheless, in absolute term, we're still at 10%, so a lot still has to be done to grow the deployment of fiber in low density area in the UK as in the rest of Europe. So with that, I'm concluding my 5 minutes, and I will be happy to further discuss this topic with you.
Thank you, Vincent. Justin, can you tell us about Ogi, and can you also include maybe some comments about what DCMS was doing?
Yes, happy to do that. So thanks, Heather. I'm Justin Leese, Chief Technology and Operations Officer at Ogi. So we are a Welsh telecoms provider, and for those of you kind of puzzling over the name, if you've ever been to a rugby match in Wales, you might hear them chanting Ogi, 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 which is where our name comes from. So very much a Welsh brand. I've spent the last sort of three and a half decades working in various operators in the UK, and also a spell at Ericsson, building networks across Europe with a number of providers. I spent about 3.5 years prior to joining Ogi. I was at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which is the department within UK government that has responsibility for digital infrastructure. So I can talk a little bit about kind of where Project Gigabit has come from, and I'll tell you a bit more about Ogi as well. So next slide, please. So I think when talking about Project Gigabit, it's probably worth kind of understanding where this $5 billion program has come from. Starting back in around about 2010, DCMS launched something called the Superfast program in the UK, a £2.6 billion program, and that was at the time focused on rolling out FTTC infrastructure around the UK, and you know, arguably has had some success in doing that, but it kind of came at a price. A strategic decision was taken to kind of focus on FTTC to kind of maximise broadband coverage in the hardest to reach areas of the UK, but kind of in the later stages of the program, that came at the cost of a lack of investment in full fibre, which was sort of paying the price for now. So you know, if you look at kind of Vincent's slides from FTTH Council for Europe and look at the FTTC numbers, you can kind of see that reflected in the data for the UK, that actually the coverage for FTTC is kind of leading amongst Europe, but it did come at this cost on fibre delivery. Winding forwards, around about 5 years ago, DCMS launched something called Local Full Fibre Networks Programme. So this was a precursor to Project Gigabit and was really about starting to stimulate the market on building full fibre. And a number of network operators across the UK took advantage of that programme to build out fibre infrastructure, predominantly focused at connecting and upgrading public buildings to full fibre. But with those anchor tenants, it gave them a springboard to build upon and build out FTTP infrastructure. Part of that, we also dabbled with unlocking public assets and deployed some fibre with Network Rail along the railway line between Manchester and Leeds to see what effect that would have on the market on sort of opening up long distance fibre routes on public assets. And then something called the Gigabit Voucher Scheme was launched, which gave rural communities the ability to apply for vouchers to subsidise gigabit capable connectivity. And then that kind of morphed into another program called the Rural Gigabit Connectivity Program, which was the original voucher scheme kind of on steroids, and offered more vouchers, but also really looked at how to upgrade public buildings in rural areas. And to date, over 1,000 schools across the UK have benefited from fibre connections in that programme. But I guess the learning from all of these different initiatives and these different types of interventions have basically been brought into Project Gigabit. So I was the programme director with responsibility for all of those programmes, portfolio of about £8 billion worth of programmes. You know, they're not the only things which were kind of underway in UK government to stimulate the market. You know, lots of work looking at barrier busting, changes to legislation, investment in 5G infrastructure, which in turn generates demand for fibre for backhaul from cell towers, and also something called the Digital Infrastructure Investment Fund, which was a fund available to operators to effectively borrow money from the government to invest in infrastructure. So there was a whole kind of basket of work that was underway, and kind of lessons learned from those various initiatives, what worked, what didn't work, and with the intention of taking those lessons learned into the new project. Next slide, please. So what are we doing in Ogi? Well, I left DCMS in March because I was, after 3.5 years in government, I was kind of missing actually building networks for real, rather than just talking about it and grant funding it. So I'm back to what I love doing, which is engineering and building networks. So we have £200 million of investment from our investors, Infra Capital. We are in the current phase building out to 150,000 premises passed in South Wales. We're just talking to our investors about the next phase of investment, which would take us to about 500,000 premises passed still in South Wales. Wales in its entirety is about 1.3 to 1.4 million premises. So that kind of takes us on a journey towards about half of UK covered with our infrastructure. But obviously our ambitions go further than that. We've for the work that we're doing at the moment, we've appointed 3 subcontractors and kind of split South Wales into 3 regions, and each of those subcontractors has a region each which they're going at, but they've got capacity to do much more and are kind of ready for our scale up. Next slide, please. Obviously, in kind of concert with building out those access networks, of course, we have to backhaul that traffic. And apart from kind of a central corridor following the motorway or freeway down across South Wales running east-west, the kind of surrounding areas are very rural. So providing diversity for that backbone network is extremely challenging. So we're part way through building that backbone. As you can see from the diagram, we've got a gap that we're working towards filling at the moment to kind of close the northern part of our ring, and kind of actively working with partners to do that at the moment. Yeah, so definitely a recurring theme for us is it's the challenge of building the access network, but also then the challenge of backhauling that traffic over distance onwards to our peering and transit points. What we're also doing, as well as building out our own infrastructure, though, is we're taking the opportunity as we build out this backbone to go into the incumbents exchanges, so into all of the Openreach exchanges, where they hand over FTTP traffic. So we are unbundling those exchanges, and that gives us the ability to take wholesale capacity from the incumbent in lieu of us building in these towns ourselves. So we kind of have a strategy of unbundle and then ultimately build our own infrastructure. Next slide, please. So we are, like many of the alternative network providers, we're building out an XGS PON-based network with Nokia as our chosen supplier, and we're live in 3 of those towns now, and we're just about to announce kind of our next tranche of towns. But certainly, these, the towns that we're focused on predominantly, the first towns we're going to have no fibre at all today, even from the incumbent. There are no cable TV services there, so we're going to those towns which have been left behind. And some of these are quite sizable towns, sort of 20, 30,000 homes, and they have no fibre today. So it's really a step change for the residents in those towns to now have kind of symmetrical gigabit services available, when today, with a following wind, they may be getting super fast if they're lucky. And of course, delivered from a Welsh company as well, which is proving to be very popular. Next slide, please. And so final slide, obviously, as well, it's not just a technical exercise of building out network, both access and backhaul, and all of the IT systems, but it's also about scaling a business as well. So we've got, massive recruitment underway, training program for, our installers and our field engineers, and all of our customer services team. We've been having to build out our logistics capability across Wales, a number of warehouses and depots, invest in a fleet of vehicles, and kind of all the tooling and training that goes with that. But ultimately, it's all worthwhile. As you can see, the top left hand there is a speed test. It's in Welsh, but you can probably figure out that's the download speed and upload speed from one of our business customers now in Haverfordwest, which was in Pembrokeshire in the extreme west of Wales. So that's a business customer that previously was getting around about 34 megabits and now has symmetrical, in excess of 900 megabits symmetrically. So with that, I'll hand back to Heather.
Thank you, Justin. Richard, an entire wholesale network in an area we normally think is pretty competitive should be a unique challenge. And I can't wait for you to tell us how it's being received in your target markets.
Sure, thanks very much. So I'm the Chief Delivery Officer here in CityFibre, responsible for the deployment of fibre across, rollout of fibre across the whole of the UK, from design through to commissioning, and then all the contract management that's needed, to support all of that. Before that, I was over in the Caribbean and North America, rolling out fibre across the Caribbean islands and into North America, and then prior to that, down in Australia doing the same thing on the NBN. So been around fibre deployment, for some time now. And I got to say that where we are right now in the UK is probably one of the most exciting times, you can be involved in fibre deployment right now. And I think you saw from Vincent's charts there that over 12 months ago, the UK was woeful. It was sitting at the bottom of the league, trying to figure out where it was going with deployment of fibre and how we could compete on a global platform in what was effectively suboptimal infrastructure. Where we are right now is a very different place. And we're rolling out fibre, as you saw there, as fast as anybody across Europe. And that's all down to I think the government and Ofcom's policy of, well, a lot of what Justin actually called out when he was in DCMS, the initiatives that we have him to thank for, which has really helped stimulate fibre rollout throughout, the whole of the UK. It really has worked. And it's worked because you can see the level of investment that's flooding into the UK market. It's enabled rapid progress by companies like CityFibre, other established alternative networks, and a wave of new entrants like Ogi to formulate and drive fibre rollout throughout the UK. So if there's one real demonstration of how government policy and industry can work together, I think this is it. It's been a real success, and we're just at the tip of that. If you just run on to the next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of where we are in CityFibre, which is, the build is accelerating away. We're scaling up exponentially month by month. We have over 25 committed network construction partners on board right now, and that's growing. We just announced yesterday that we delivered our 1 millionth ready for service premise. I know on the slide there it says by the end of the year, but we achieved that milestone yesterday. So that's a huge testament again to the organization and to the environment that we're working in. And that's not network passed nearby, as you might hear somewhere else. That's actually ready to connect within a few days' notice of an order. So that was 1 million ready for service premises done yesterday. So that's a great achievement. And then by 2025, we'll be across a third of the UK. That's approximately 8 million homes, 800,000 businesses, and 400,000 public sector sites. And as we start to expand the portfolio, we're looking to also address the mobile sector. That's going to be in and around the 250,000 5G access points that we pretty much signed up to do with a number of our partners. So all in all, we're going to be across 285 cities, towns, and villages. It's kind of, you're getting into that gray area of the definition of a village and a town, but pretty much how we're architecting the network says we've got 285 of them. And that's with full fibre infrastructure, not fibre to the cabinet or anything else. It's full fibre infrastructure, serving all clients with what is going to be symmetrical upload and download. So we've just had our latest financing announcement as well, and again, I think it's a level of confidence that investors have got in the UK market and in companies like ours to really drive these plans forward and to start hitting some of the more difficult areas that were part and parcel of years gone by. If you just run on to the next slide, please. This is kind of my last slide. It just really summarizes where we are as a company. In September 21, just gone, we announced the largest ever capital raise for UK full fibre deployment. That was over £1.12 billion to support the 4 billion rollout. And that's enabled our participation in BD UK's Project Gigabit program for rural coverage. And we'll come on to that, I guess, a bit later on in the presentation. But it really was a great success. That brings on board Mudabla and Integro, and they join our existing shareholders of Goldman Sachs and Antin as well as a number of new banks that have, really put their money behind the plan and wanted to invest in CityFibre, which is great news. And in a deal of this size, it's only possible thanks to investor confidence. That's confidence in CityFibre, clearly, in the position that we hold in the market, but also confidence in the government and confidence that the government's commitments are going to hold. Back to some of the initiatives that Justin referred to that's coming out of DCMS, they are critical to the whole future of not just CityFibre, but also a number of some of the altnets that are popping up across the UK, because it's that's allowing companies like ours and others to address conurbations that were traditionally just difficult to do. The business cases didn't pay in, commercially they weren't viable, and everybody kind of shied away from them. But with this government commitment that's now on the table, then that's what a lot of people are getting behind, and that's what a lot of business plans are supporting in order to deliver fibre to that last 15-20% of the UK population. The two main call-outs I'll just pull out of the left-hand side here are really, Bechtel and Fibre Nation. We've done a partnership, an alliance deal with Bechtel. That's really bringing in-house a lot of the Bechtel core capability of project management and contract management. For everybody that's been involved in fibre rollout, you'll understand that having the plan is one thing, actually executing is something very different. So bolstering up our project management capability is something that we've invested heavily in, and that's benefited our build partners as well along that journey. The other one is Fibre Nation. We'll see a lot more of market consolidation as we go through the next few years. This was, our third one that we've done, but it's the one that really got us the fibre footprint in the Northwest. It's allowed us to grow our business out of the Northwest as well. And then on the right-hand side, I've talked about, the investment. And on the customer side, you can see there, we've got a range of national and local ISPs that are on board. And the way that we've architected and designed the network means that, we will give national access to local ISPs as and when they need it, without them having to unbundle any exchanges. We build our own fixes. We don't rely on BT. And what we've done is we've provided aggregated demand points throughout the UK. So that's enabled our ISPs to architect their own business plans and address a national footprint at a fraction of the cost. So all in all, CityFibre are really pushing at pace ahead with plan. Passing that 1 million mark yesterday was a great celebration for the company. And again, I think it's testament to where the UK is currently going and heading in its aspirations to roll out fibre nationally. So
Thank you, Richard.
That, I'll hand back, I think.
Yes, thanks. Steve, speaking of areas that it's been difficult to make the business case, you really are targeting the more remote areas. Can you tell us how some of the challenges and whether Project Gigabit will help you with that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the introduction, Heather. And afternoon all. Steve Leighton, CEO and founder of Voneus. I've got one slide. This isn't it, you'll be pleased to hear. So if we could move on to the next slide. There we go. My first and last slide. So who are we? What do we do? How do we do it? So essentially, like Justin and Richard, we build infrastructure. And we've set ourselves up as a full ISP. So our model is very much about owning the infrastructure and owning the customer. And although we are, as you can see on my second point, supported and funded by Macquarie Capital and the Israel Infrastructure Fund, we don't actually call ourselves an infrastructure company. We call ourselves a customer acquisition company. And that's primarily because our focus is to get homes connected, not homes passed. In fact, the two words in the industry that I probably hate more than any other two words are homes passed. And that's primarily, and that's not a criticism of the guys who use homes passed as a key metric. It's largely because they are backed by infrastructure funds who give them a clear directive to go and build infrastructure. No surprise there. One of the key metrics they impose to that infrastructure build is homes passed. And if you want to get bang for your buck and go past as many homes as possible for as little money as possible, you build in areas where there are lots of homes. We don't have that luxury. We've never really had that luxury. As a business, I'll give you a little bit of history. as a business, we actually started life a few years ago as a pure technology business. We developed our own VoIP software backbone, we developed our own VoIP hardware, and then combined the two and took a VoIP solution to market for all users, irrespective of size and scale. And then we found quite early in that journey that most of our customers, most of the people that wanted our VoIP solution, were in rural or semi-rural areas with very poor connectivity. And one thing you need if you want a decent VoIP solution is connectivity. So we researched the market, we saw the size and scale of the problem in rural UK. We looked at what government support was available, and Justin talked a little bit about the Rural Gigabit Voucher Scheme, and we've been great beneficiaries of that scheme. So we pivoted as a business. And I think one of our advantages at that time was that we had no idea what we were doing. And I mean that in a good way, because often if you come into a market with no prior knowledge and no preconceived ideas, you look at it differently and you attack it differently. And we started off with a purely wireless solution. So we looked at rural communities. We trialed a satellite backhaul solution that worked for the community, but didn't really work for us because it wasn't commercially viable to roll out satellite solution in the UK on a larger scale. So we then went for a fibre backhaul solution, but using fixed wireless access to deliver into these difficult to reach communities. What we found remarkably was levels of take up went through the roof. So our very first community, which is a village in Bedfordshire, which was 321 homes, within 6 months of us going live in that community, we had 297 of those homes as customers. We pretty much got them all. And then we replicated that success across a number of communities. We're now live in over 400 UK communities, and our communities are small. Our average community size is around 180 to 220 homes. But when you get 75% plus of those residences on your network, it very soon makes money, which comes back to my point about customer acquisition. We've always been a business, despite the fact that we're now incredibly well funded and incredibly well supported. We've been a business that has eaten what it's killed, so to speak. So our fixed wireless access model, every installation that we built was break even or better in less than 2 years. On fibre, every installation that we build is break even or better in less than 3.5 years. And that is a kind of good model for us, and it's certainly a good model for our investors. We're very community led. So although we're rural and semi-rural exclusively, we don't necessarily tackle isolated dwellings. We like to have a kind of beachhead community and build out from there from a fixed wireless access perspective. And wireless will always remain, well, certainly for the next 2 or 3 years, remains a key part of our model. And the reason for that is quite simple. When you attack these rural communities, they just want to get online, and they want to get online quickly. And quite frankly, in the early days, they don't really care where the service comes from. They just want a service that's affordable, accessible, and reliable. So we use wireless as a Trojan horse or beachhead project. We go in, build the wireless network, get them online in 2 to 3 months. And then once we get to a certain level of penetration in those communities, and 65% is our target, which we achieve within the 6 to 9 month window, as I mentioned earlier, we then flip to fibre. So what I mean by that is that we overbuild our own fixed wireless access with our own fibre. Or occasionally gigabit wireless if there's a difficult to reach 2 or 3 properties in that community that don't quite make it into the fibre footprint cut. What we find when we do that is that our fibre builds become a lot bigger than our fixed wireless access build. So the village that I mentioned in Bedfordshire, it's a place called Dunton, which is fairly close to Biggleswade. Biggleswade is a virgin city in as much as or a virgin town. It's got full virgin fibre to the premise across all of Biggleswade. Dunton is 5 kilometres to the west of Biggleswade and has nothing apart from our solution. We've now built fibre into Dunton, but a 321 home fixed wireless access build, because of the journey that the fibre took to get there, has become a 6,500 premise fibre build. So that's kind of what we're seeing replicated. That's the hub and spoke or the beachhead model that I referenced earlier. We use wireless. We have three key criteria when we are overbuilding our wireless. One is that we include all of our existing customers in the fibre build. Two is that there's a good voucherability density in those sites. So we look for 50% of the properties we're building to have some kind of voucher attached to them, which helps mitigate the risks associated with more expensive rural fibre build. And number three, we tend to try and go where nobody else is going. So that the bigger guys like Richard and like BT and Virgin and others are very open and are very public about where they're going to be building. So we've taken a scalpel to a map of the UK and carved out a fairly realistic aspiration of about 250,000 homes where we believe no one's going to go between now and 2026. And that's our target market. Now, that doesn't sound like I feel like the smallest kid in the playground when people are talking about 8 million homes, 12 million homes, 25 million homes in the case of BT. But actually, we're very confident that we can get to those 250,000 homes relatively quickly and get 60% of them connected, which is the key for us. So it's about connecting those rural communities and bringing those people the services that the rest of us take for granted. So our aspirations are realistic. And although that's a small number, it's still expensive to reach that number. The average cost per premise, if you're Richard, and I don't know your model inside out, Richard, but you're probably looking in the city at somewhere between £200 and £400 for each premise that you passed as a build cost. In rural areas, you double that and a bit more. You're looking at £1,000 plus for every premise that we pass. And that is why we need the support of the voucher scheme to help mitigate the costs associated with the expensive build, but also why, more importantly, we need the customers. Because a customer, a home connected means revenue. And we're a business that's all about generating revenue to keep our shareholders happy.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you for all four of you for these great overviews and really setting the stage. So I have, obviously, because of my experience at FBA and with FTTH EU, have seen their historical data over the years. And UK penetration of high-speed broadband, it's not just the slide from 2020, but it hasn't been stellar among the EU neighbors. And I'm wondering what caused the initial lack of deployment that we are now trying to change with Project Gigabit. Do you all have an opinion on that? I don't care who'd like to ever go first.
I'm happy to do 30 seconds and then hand over to somebody. So, I mean, Justin touched on it. We invested quite heavily as a nation in FTTC a few years ago, and there was a feeling within central government and within the primary incumbent in the UK that enhanced copper network would satisfy our requirements for several years to come. That clearly hasn't turned out to be the case. And I always use the example of Netflix, which 6 or 7 years ago was a DVD delivery business. Okay, they used to put DVDs through the post box in your house and you'd watch them and then send them back. Now it's in every home and it's in every home digitally. So I think when the investment was made in enhancements around FTTC, there was no real understanding of what was going to come into our homes and increase the bandwidth required to deliver.
I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. I think, and as well, if this COVID pandemic has highlighted anything, it's the absolute dependency that people have on not just connectivity, but reliable connectivity. And to your first question, I think that the UK really fell behind other countries as a result of that dependency on FTTC, as Steve just said. And I think for those in the US, that's the similar policy to that was followed by the FCC under I think it was the 96 Telecoms Act, I remember when I was back there. But that was with only limited competitive pressure from cable cos. So it meant that the incumbent BT was free to go for the low-cost solution of FTTC rather than put any investment into FTTP. But it's now changing, and I think the government and the regulator, they're jointly committed to catching up with our peers. You saw that from Vincent's charts earlier. And the key has been the shift towards the infrastructure competition, with the likes of ourselves, City Fibre, entering the market to roll out FTTP. And you've seen the reaction. I mean, that's forced BT and indeed Virgin to announce their own full fibre investment plans, because this is such an aggressive market right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd add to that because I've got two perspectives. One from my role in government, but actually prior to joining the UK government, I was at the incumbent as a strategy director. So, I was there. I was at Openreach for a relatively short time. I was in the part of Openreach that faced into business, and that part of Openreach had pivoted to fibre with a product they call Ethernet Access Direct, and had dropped its copper products. I battled internally to convince the organisation to pivot to full fibre for residential as well as business. Got fed up of banging my head against that particular wall, joined the government. And I think with the initiatives that we launched in government, particularly local full fibre networks, I think we moved the dial on the incumbent more in the 3.5 years I was there than I did in my time at Openreach. I've got I take pleasure in keeping a set of quotes from Clive Selley from the time that I was there, where he says is quoted in the Telegraph as saying investing in fibre is a mug's game, and his strategy was to invest in GFast in the towns and long reach VDSL in rural areas to kind of protect and continue to sweat the copper network. But of course, if you read the press now about the hats off to them, their switch to fibre has been dramatic in the last couple of years, and the pace they're building now is impressive. And if you read quotes from Clive now, it was all their idea. But you don't have to wind back very far, and it was a very different story. So I think I think the incumbent was slow to pivot to fibre. I think it took people like City Fibre to be investing billions in fibre to frighten the incumbent, and it took some intervention from government, and government was a bit slow to pivot its programmes to fibre. But when it did, as Richard said in his pitch, the market has followed, and we set out in government to stimulate the market to build fibre, albeit to Vincent's slides, from a low base. And the market has responded, and the investors have responded, and we're now in catch up. And we were slow to get there, but boy, are we building fast now, and are there lots of companies piling in and doing this? But it took a while for us to pivot, and we were just late to the party.
Yeah, and Vincent, how do you think that Project Gigabit compares to other EU programs? We have you on mute.
My apologies, I was on mute. I think every country in Europe start more or less from the same situation. Legacy networks are not the same, but in every country where we've seen acceleration of fiber deployment, it starts with a clear objective and framework laid out by the government. Deploying fiber it's a vision for the next generation. It's a vision for the next 30 years. And if you don't have the government leading with clear objectives and with setting the conditions for healthy competition, things will not start. And what we see now in the UK is that thanks to this framework, you have private investment, you have a lot of entrepreneurs, and things is going in the right direction. Now, your question on Project Gigabit, I think it is a very important and very additional initiative which will help showing a clear commitment in favor of full fiber. It brings essential funding and public money to support the development in low density area, which is essential to close the digital divide. What was said that the bulk of the financing will come from the private sector, but the role of the public money is essential for those low density areas. And I think it reinforced that market dynamic, which was initiated a couple of years back, and is good for the evolution of the business model of every panelist we have today on this program.
Is this a model that's been used in other European countries? And I only ask this because no political statement here, Brexit or no, you all are competing against your neighbors for employment. And supply chain resources, and all of that is driven by the kind of connectivity you have. So how have other European nations propelled fiber deployment? Is it a similar model?
I mean, if the question is to me, every country is different. At the FTTH Council, we do not necessarily favor one model over the other. We have actually studied in depth 8 successful business model of fiber operators, and that covers vertically integrated operators, co-financing model like you see in France, retail demand aggregation, and of course several version of wholesale-based model. So there's no one solution which works in every environment, but clearly in the UK, the combination of incumbent activity and a lot of wholesale-only operators gives a very competitive situation, a mix of competition and cooperation, which definitely helps the rollout in the UK.
I think the key as well there is ensuring that we have the stability in the government and in the regulatory frameworks, the stability and the confidence of certainty. I mean, you know, what if there's any doubt as to whether or not that's going to change, or whether there's going to be, you know, a dramatic shift in that voucher scheme, for example, that Steve referred to earlier, it's very, very difficult then to kind of get the level of investment that we're looking at. I think without question, the majority of fiber rollout, 80% plus, is going to be driven by, you know, commercial investment by the private sector. It's that final 20% that we really need the certainty and the clarity on from both the government and the regulator, and that will then allow companies like Steve's and others to really address that last 15-20% of the market.
Interesting.
And I think that's a really important point. I think, you know, I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, Project Gigabit will be massively helpful to all of the network builders in getting to the harder to reach areas and kind of gap funding in such a way that, you know, premises that are and customers that are commercially unattractive, it closes the gap and makes them look attractive. But I think in doing that, it needs to make sure the funding does go into those areas, and it's not going into areas which we would otherwise commercially build, because that would just be a waste of public funding if we were going to go there. So I think the open market reviews and the public consultations need to be done carefully, and the analysis of the data needs to be done carefully, so we don't end up publicly funding areas which the market would go to anyway, and all of that good government funding goes into the areas that need it the most. And I think the other thing I'd add is, you know, Project Gigabit, whilst it's incredibly helpful, is not the only thing government needs to do to help us. There is a whole load of other barriers to building fibre, where government really needs to keep work up on, you know, things like wayleaves, particularly for multi-dwelling units, and getting access into those continues to be really challenging. Street works, fibre taxation, all of these things are barriers which even with government funding, it doesn't matter if these barriers are in the way to stop you building. And I think the other thing as well is, you know, having stimulated the market and got a number of other providers now building, I think the regulator just needs to be really careful that they don't relax controls on the incumbent so quickly that it then stifles that good competition which has now been created.
I think you're right. I mean, Steve mentioned it earlier, right, when he was talking about, you know, businesses like ours and others announcing plans where we're going to build. Again, it's critical that companies that are bringing either, you know, subsidized schemes through DCMS, or indeed, you know, investment through the private sector, that we have clarity on build plans. Saying you're going to build somewhere is one thing, actually building somewhere is something very different. And there's got to have to be some form of, let's just say, critical analysis of those plans, so that the next 2-3 years worth of investment opportunities really do open up. Because without that, it's going to be, it is going to be difficult.
The other thing I think is fascinating, and I want to ask Vincent about if he had seen this in the rest of Europe, was the involvement of large capitalized infrastructure companies in your business. For Ogi, it's Infra Capital. For Voneus, McInerney. and City Fibre has project management and installation assistance from Bechtel. Is that, I don't think we hear about that so much in this country, but is that a common thing? Obviously it is in UK now, and Richard's saying it's because of the stability of the investment market. Vincent, have you seen that in other EU countries?
Well, on the investment side of your question, absolutely. Infrastructure funds are now seeing FTTH infrastructure as very, very attractive long-term investment, as well as many banks. So probably equivalent to the attractiveness of wireless tower at some point, or investment in mobile network at another period. This is clearly an area where those expecting stable and visible investment over 20, 30 years, they are really very happy to invest there. So there is no lack of private investment in most European countries. And when it comes to Bechtel and the use of project management construction company, what we tend to see, this is not an area we are studying specifically, but what we tend to see is that many of them used to be only national, local. We tend to see expansion. Some of them are becoming pan-European, and it makes sense because when you have a country which is close to have finished its rollout, it makes sense that all this capability could potentially go to another country which has more potential for rollout. So there is clearly an interesting thing to observe for these operators in Europe.
And I'm assuming all three of you have really benefited from the involvement of these companies.
Well,
Yeah.
Bechtel definitely, but I think, you know, that's different to the investment discussion. I think from a pure investment perspective, it really was about confidence in the business plan, about confidence in the regulatory environment, about confidence in the government, in the government's position. That's why, you know, we've secured that £1 billion of investment. And I think that what complements that is then providing confidence to those investors that we can deliver against the plan, hence bringing on board, you know, world-class project management and contract management capability. So a combination of the two has really, you know, helped and secure that huge level of investment.
Yeah, and I mean, we're definitely seeing the same at Ogi as well. I mean, you know, obviously the investment itself is essential, but I think also, you know, having an infrastructure investor, you know, they bring to the party a lot of experience of how you scale up a business, and we found that very helpful. And you know, Infra Capital are also invested in GigaClear, in Fibrous, in White Fibre, and in Neos Networks as well. So it's almost created a sort of family of UK companies with the same investor in common, and we're able to kind of share our experiences and best practice between those companies, and that's been really invaluable for us.
And Steve, you've had investment from two companies that are headquartered in different countries. Has that brought a good experience to you all as you build out in rural areas?
Yeah, and I think, you know, both Justin and Richard touched on it. What Macquarie and the Israel Infrastructure Fund bring us is expertise and knowledge. Right? They've done this before. And Macquarie have made investments outside the UK, although they're headquartered in Sydney. They have flagship offices in the States and in London. So they've done a number of investments in this space that have been successful. So they brought that knowledge with them to our place. And equally, IIF. You know, IIF have covered most of the infrastructure investment inside Israel, including some fibre. They've done a couple of fibre investments outside Israel, I believe. We're their first one in the UK, but they bring expertise. And as Justin said, that they all have aspirations to scale the businesses up and get them to a significantly higher valuation than when they came in. That's why they do what they do, and they help us achieve those milestones by bringing that expertise to the table. So it's not just about money.
That's terrific. Project Gigabit seems to indicate that the builds will be all an open access type of build. And I guess I wanted to ask a couple things. Are those contracts like a traditional incumbent franchise? Are they designed not to have competitors? How does that work?
No, it's absolutely not. It's, well, and we'd hope that's not the outcome at least. So it is a competitive process.
That's the question.
Yeah, exactly. So so DCMS are kind of structuring it so that they will run open market reviews in a particular area to kind of first understand what commercial build is underway, and then that will then identify where is not going to be built commercially. Depending on how many premises there are in those areas, they'll then carve up the UK into different sizes of contract, large, medium and small, and they've got a slightly different commercial approach depending whether it's a larger or a smaller contract, but effectively to bid into all of those, whether they're very large or very small, will be a competitive process. So everybody has an opportunity, and I think it's fair to say under the Superfast program, a very large proportion of the funding did go to the incumbent, but then other altnets such as GigaClear did pick up a number of those contracts, and Fibre in Northern Ireland more recently picked up Project Stratum. So there's definitely a track record with DCMS that they do award to altnets as well as the incumbent, and I'd like to think moving forward into Project Gigabit we'll see more of the altnets getting a share of the pie.
I think you're right. Sorry, Heather, back to the declaring of those build plans, it will just make much more economic sense and commercial sense to be building in those areas where there is a presence. Overbuilding and competition for what will be subcontractor resource, again, is going to do nothing but add to additional cost and complexity in the rollout plans. So I think, again, the government and certainly the regulator has a huge part to play in making sure that everybody is kind of, is presenting the build plans, the phasing, the timing in line with the award of those areas.
Yeah,
Steve,
I would support that. And yeah, and it's essentially, the overbuild point is an interesting point. If you look at the way that the Project Gigabit appears to be shaping up in the UK in terms of its allocation on a kind of region by region, town by town, village by village basis, there are two types of procurement. Type A, which is the more rural locations, which of course is the bit I'm very interested in, and then Type B, which is the kind of larger towns, which, as Justin pointed out, that you haven't got to look very far to find relatively large conurbations with no fibre. Now, it is no secret that the incumbent will probably bid for a huge chunk of the Type B element, simply because they're fighting off City Fibre and Virgin in their urban areas. There's an urban turf war going on, and that's going to spill out into the rural streets at some point in the future. And we're anxious to ensure when we get we're quite successful in terms of carving out niches for ourselves. We've made a couple of successful representations to DCMS to allow sites to be left out of the Project Gigabit procurements because we are already there wirelessly and have already started to build fibre. However, there is still a concern, and I'm not sure if Justin shares this, given where Ogi are building, that when the Gigabit announcements are made and the larger companies get their slugs or get their sites, then to join one of those sites to another one of those sites, they might well roll their tanks across our lawn because they'll make an excuse that it's commercially the most viable route for them to just come and overbuild us. And then you get involved in a race to the bottom on price. And we've never really wanted to engage in that kind of war.
The last question, I know this is going to be interesting to all audiences, is I understand that you have to build open access networks. Is that true even in the very rural areas, Steve? Because I've worked with a lot of open access providers here in the US, and it's something that I'm very supportive of, but I also know you have to have a certain population level to support multiple ISPs on that network. So I was wondering, do they differentiate between size of community?
They don't actually, and that's I guess that's one of the anomalies around the scheme. If we build a community of of 180 homes and we get 160 of them as our customers within the first few months of build. And then after a fixed period of time, we open that network up to others. You kind of wonder what's left for them, really,
Right.
in terms of one of the conditions around Project Gigabit success is that you have to be able to present a sensible wholesale model. Now, for a business like mine, to create a wholesale platform that DCMS would find acceptable is a huge investment. City Fibre, as Richard has already explained, set themselves out from day one to be a wholesale only model. So they have that platform and they've invested an awful lot of money in building that platform. We don't have that platform within Voneus today. And it's a big decision for us and a huge investment decision for us to go down that road. So from our perspective, we're going to milk the voucher scheme for as long as we can and potentially avoid Project Gigabit in the short term until it's clear that the Type A procurements are going to be a protected procurement.
Okay, that's very interesting because in this country, we think you have to have about 10,000 subscribers before you start and make an open access network with multiple ISPs work economically.
In one town, 10,000 in one area.
Yeah. On one system, yeah.
Yeah, it's, I mean, it's unfortunately it's a legislative matter at the root. So it's actually part of, well, originally the European Union law, but now UK law that, as part of the state aid rules or state subsidy rules, that for these types of procurement, it does need to be open access. The voucher scheme that Steve talks about kind of gets around this because it's done on a de minimis basis, and actually the end customer is requesting the voucher and is the beneficiary of the funding, not the network operator. Yeah. But for the larger procurements, the operator is benefiting from state funding, and therefore the feeling in law is that rather than give an advantage to one operator, that state funding should be equally benefiting all operators. So that's where the open access requirement comes from. I mean, what I would say is in practice on the Superfast program, whilst a number of the altnets successfully bid into that and have a wholesale product, it's not actually been widely used because the complexity of dealing with a large number of small alternative network providers as an ISP has put many of them off. So there are many altnets that have a wholesale product because they bid into these government projects, but actually take up of it has been relatively low.
Yeah. Well, and this conversation has. Oh, sorry, Richard.
Sorry, I was just going to say. Go ahead. I was going to say that Steve mentioned that we adopted an entirely wholesale only open access approach to the market from day one. That's how we set our stall out, and that's what we've stuck to. So we invite retail ISPs to adopt the use of that infrastructure, who in turn then obviously commercialize that onto the end user. And we've been very, very successful at that. So I think we're well placed as this scheme starts to roll out. But what's going to destroy value in the whole chain, as I say, is that if we don't get fair access to the right geographical footprints as a result of not being able to transparently discuss plans and where we're trying to build. That's a difficult one for DCMS to regulate. I must admit, it's going to be a very interesting few months coming up. But I think we've set our stall out really clearly, really early, and that will hopefully drive us to the right outcome.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you. We are way past the top of the hour, and I'm looking for David to come on and wrap it up. But I think this has been great, and I would love to have you guys back on in 6 months and see how you all are doing.
Sure.
Definitely.
That'd be good.
Thanks so much to our panelists for their time and expertise today. The recording will be made available to all participants and through our website. This will wrap it up for this edition of the Broadband Bunch Zero Touch Learning Series. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.